This lecture is to walk you guys through the Modernist movement, and I had this as a Prezi, but I'm having some issues with embedding it, so I'm just going to make a video out of it, trying to keep things a little easy. But essentially, the Modernist movement, we're moving into World War One and post-World War One, and we're looking at how things are really drastically changing after the trauma of the war. This was, of course, the Great War. This was, a terrible atrocity that no one could fathom. Mass violence on that scale. And you see a lot of repercussions in terms of social structures, political structures, economic structures, and that is really portrayed and parlayed into this literary movement that kind of takes shape. So it was really highly experimental and basically changed structures and played with structures in ways that we had never seen done. If you've ever read something like William Carlos Williams or T.S. Eliot, you'll know that the imagery, the stark imagery that's used, is very impactful, and they change how we read literature. So this really started with a modernist manifesto like Ezra Pound's A Retrospect, and you see a resurgence or connection essentially back to the ideas of art, music, culture, politics, literature after the sort of industrial age that happened in the late 19th century. So as we continue on, let's see if I can get this to work. Oh goodness, I'm so sorry guys. Just zoom in here, make life a little easier. Some of the causes of, I can get this to work. Goodness. Some of the major writers and texts that you'll see in the Modernist movement are things like Eliot, Pound, William Carlos Williams. You might have read The Red Wheelbarrow before. Steinbeck, of course, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Ellison, and then a lot of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance, like Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, and Claude McKay. So likely you've read some of these, if not many of these, and that might give you kind of an understanding of how these different authors portray the experiences around, World War I and World War II. See what I can do here. Such issues, I apologize, guys. So some of the major themes that I wanted to call your attention to here were really due to the trauma of World War I, and they became themes that we see throughout modernist texts, and of course they're exacerbated by World War II. So things like psychological trauma, the idea of madness or insanity, the ideas of introspection, self-introspection, and disillusionment. So this focus on the self and this focus on understanding the self and what is a human being, what does it mean to be human are very key elements in modernist movement, and disillusionment absolutely takes root with a lot of different bodies, whether it's political bodies or social structures or things or even just understanding why the status quo can be broken. The distrust of institutional control as well, and a crisis of equality. So we see the women's movement, we see the African American civil rights movement kind of start to take shape. We see issues with nativism and Native Indigenous people. And then as we kind of go through here, there was a group of a generation, essentially, as famously called the Lost Generation by Gertrude Stein. And one key part of this was that there was a disillusionment with America and American identity. And this was kind of a global understanding after World War I, was that the world was never going to be the same. In one sense, the world was more connected than ever. We had gone through this sort of global war, which connected people across, geographical divides, but also in the sense that, as I said, there was a huge disillusionment with political bodies and governments, and a deep mistrust kind of formed. And part of that was this mass exodus, as you see, of American expats living in Europe, where there is a sense of post-World War I, you have the kind of the roaring 20s, you have this sense of freedom, you have this sort of rebirth of arts, culture, and music. Of course, the advent of different media like television and radio and movies, and a little bit later television. But they really talk about kind of the freedoms that happen in this new space, and then the disillusionment with the bourgeois establishment. So it's no longer the will of the elite, it's the will of the people. And they're starting to cross boundaries of what's politically correct, what's polite society, what can we talk about in terms of sexual freedom, mental illness, poverty, multiculturalism, and much, much more. And of course, Gertrude Stein was very famous. She ran a salon, a particularly famous salon in Paris that included painters like Picasso and Hemingway, Fitzgerald. And she, of course, coined the term the lost generation. So she used that term to describe the sort of collective trauma experienced by those who fought and lived through World War I. And then as we kind of come out here, let me see if I can get this to work. We see things that like unreliable narrators as a major motif in modernist literature. So because there was this disillusionment with the establishment, this idea was that you really can't trust anyone. And so we had these unreliable narrators who kind of take root into a lot of literature, and that narrators compromise either purposely or inadvertently. And this really was a reflection of the shift in the role of artists in society, who were kind of seen as conduits for they're talking about the irrational state of humanity. And then in terms of style, a lot of modernist writers really started to work with kind of messing with the established style. So things were not, you have things like enjambment, where you have lines of poetry that run over into the next line. And none of this may not be new, but there was an adaptation of these different structures that was kind of widespread. You have someone like Sylvia Plath, who really plays with style and also really stark imagery. And you have stream of consciousness style, which kind of takes over in some cases, which kind of is supposed to represent this idea of the psychology of the character and a lot of their trauma. And this idea of a chaotic psyche is really interesting. It's something you see a lot. So again, like I said, think Sylvia Plath, think Gertrude Stein even. And there's multiple sub-movements within modernism, like surrealism, nativism, and the Harlem Renaissance, that either depend upon or borrow similar structures, but for different purposes. And as we kind of continue on, I want to make sure we don't miss out. I apologize for this Prezi, which is not perfect. But essentially that gives you kind of an idea here of what the modernist movement is, some of the major ideas, how they're really starting to disrupt the status quo, and how that's reflected with the different social movements that are taking place, political movements that are taking place, as well as the collective idea of trauma amongst this generation, and how they sort of worked to kind of work through that trauma in different ways. And you see this kind of play in soon after in the postmodernist movement, where we get into kind of the world that we live in now. So hopefully it gives you kind of a good idea as a starting point, and gives you an introduction to the modernist movement.